Welcome participants to ASP's final meeting of the day, of the week of Looking Beyond the First 100 Days series. We're going to give a couple minutes here, or a minute or so for all the participants to join in and get on, and then we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a good group here with us today. I see already 40 or more, and we're anticipating it to grow even more. This is going to be a great discussion today, and I know that everybody's focus, of course, is maybe not on great power competition with China right now, given the headlines. But here at ASP, we like to think about not the headlines of today, but what's going to be in the headlines tomorrow. We like to look beyond the horizon, think about what's coming up. I'm going to go ahead and get started. ASP is a nonpartisan, the American Security Project is a nonpartisan national security think tank founded under the motto of vision, strategy, and dialogue. That means we like to think about the long-term threats and challenges that face our country, devise strategies for how to deal with those, and then have a dialogue across parties, across countries, and throughout our society on how to build that national security. This is the third event this week in our Looking Beyond the First 100 Days of the Biden administration series. We've been joined by members of Congress, current and former ambassadors and policymakers, practitioners, academics, first on climate change and national security, then yesterday on public diplomacy in the upcoming Biden administration. And today we're going to talk about great power competition and the rise of China and devising an American strategy for dealing with the rise of China. When we first planned this event series, we had no idea of the threats that would be posed to our democracy over the past week and a half or so. ASP was founded 15 years ago to defend our democracy against threats to our national security. And I think now more than ever, it's important to bring together all sides of the aisle, bipartisanship, to forge ahead in the upcoming days, months, and years. So we are very lucky and honored to be joined by ASP board member Admiral Bill Fallon and Congressman Don Bacon. I'm going to introduce them each briefly, then each of them will engage in a dialogue and discussion on this issue. Participants are welcome to enter questions into the chat function, the Q&A function below. I'll then be presenting them to the panelists and we can have a discussion. First, Congressman Don Bacon represents Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, including the city of Omaha. A career electronic warfare officer in the Air Force, Congressman Bacon served nearly 30 years on active duty, spanning 16 assignments around the globe, holding multiple commands and retiring as a brigadier general. Following his retirement, he was elected to the House of Representatives in 2016. Since 2017, he has served as a member of the House Armed Services Committee. His subcommittee assignments have included the Tactical Air and Land Forces Subcommittee, the Intelligence and Emerging Threats and Capabilities Subcommittee, and the Military Personnel Subcommittee. He has been named to the National Defense Authorization Act Bicameral Conference Committee every year since 2017 and is a leading voice on defense strategy and military readiness. He serves on the Republican Study Committee National Security Task Force and the U.S. Air Force Academy Board of Visitors. He co-chairs the Congressional Electronic Warfare Caucus, the Intelligence, Surveillance, and Reconnaissance Caucus, the Baltic Caucus, and the Congressional Brain Injury Task Force. A full slate. Admiral William J. Fallon retired from the U.S. Navy after a distinguished 40-year career of military and strategic leadership. He has led U.S. and allied forces in 8 separate commands and played a leadership role in military and diplomatic matters at the highest levels of the U.S. government. As head of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Fallon directed all U.S. military operations in the Middle East, Central Asia, and Horn of Africa, focusing on combat efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan. He led the U.S. Pacific Command for 2 years, focusing political military activities in the Asia-Pacific region. His achievements include a resumption of military engagement with China, new outreach to India, a new agreement on a strategic framework with Japan, and humanitarian assistance to the victims of the 2004 tsunami in Southeast Asia. He also served as presidential envoy to Japan, handling bilateral relations after the collision of a U.S. submarine and a Japanese fishing vessel. His career is distinguished, and we are lucky to have him as a board member and an advisor to the American Security Project. Today, we're going to talk about the rise of China, but I can think of no person better to start us than Admiral Fallon. Admiral Fallon, over to you. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Andrew. And Congressman Bacon, great to see you again, and I much appreciate your deference to age over beauty this morning to let me kick off this event. So great power competition, the challenges today. So a little bit of a scene setter. I think it's worth keeping in mind the U.S. certainly still the dominant power in the world in virtually every area. However, we've suffered a significant loss in reputation and influence recently, and we're being challenged militarily by particularly China and Russia in very serious and unprecedented ways. So Russia and China, there are different kind of challenges coming from different backgrounds and capabilities and strategies, but they do share a common interest, and that is to diminish U.S. power and influence for their own reasons, and to do this worldwide. They have different priorities, but they often act in ways that are complementary to work to try to achieve their diminishment of U.S. influence. U.S. is in a long-term global competition. We need to recognize it. It's very serious. I think it's as serious as the Cold War, but it's very different in many, many ways. And the answer here, just to go to my bottom line, is we need a whole of government response, and we need to be putting on our thinking caps, because this is not the same as the old Cold War, and we'd be making a big mistake if we followed a script that we did back in those days. So what should we do? I think we ought to be non-reactive, and that's what we've been lately. Somebody does something, particularly one of these two countries, and we immediately jump up and try to counter it. So we're in kind of a whack-a-mole business, very transactional, not very strategic, and I think not what we need to do. I believe we need credible and effective, strong policies. And I believe very strongly in that it ought to be starting domestically. So, make America great. Yeah, I'd love to see America made great, but we need to start here in this country with things that give us the kind of foundation base that enables us to do things around the world. And of course, we need help from our allies, and we need to work carefully and consider their inputs. Just a couple of thoughts about each, Russia and China, in a little bit of detail to again set the scene. So Russia, very autocratic rule. There's little dissent tolerated. You can see that in what's going on with Mr. Navalny and with other people. Putin's in charge, and he aims to stay there, and they're not going to brook much dissent. They do have a vast stockpile of nuclear weapons, and they've been refurbishing their conventional military capabilities, particularly in submarines and missiles, where they've got a significantly large and robust and modern tech base. They have lots of energy. In fact, that's their primary economic sphere, as you know. They export oil and gas, and they do it all over the world, and that brings in most of the revenue for this country. It's a vast territory. And the key new thing that I think we ought to keep in mind, as global warming changes the Arctic, the Russian landmass has a vast frontage across that Arctic, and that's opening up all kinds of possibilities, both in economic and military areas that heretofore we never thought about. So that's something we got to keep in mind. They're very skilled technologists. They have skills in engineering and metallurgy that are as good as anybody in the world. And they've always been very good in the information technology area. And we're seeing that in many respects here. They've had recent geopolitical success in their near abroad. Their activities in Ukraine and in Belarus and in other places. And they've exported that to other places in the world, such as Syria, where they've been really thumping their chest in an effort to regain a worldview of their power. And I think the one thing that we ought to keep in mind is they're very, very experienced in the business of information exploitation. and influence operations. And again, we're seeing that at many dimensions. This is nothing new. They've been at this for decades, but they're good at it. China's got a vast population. It's grown in economic clout in absolutely unprecedented manner in the last several decades. Their military power is beginning to match that economic growth. Not surprising, shouldn't surprise us at all. They've got vast sums of money now and resources, and so they're rebuilding their military, and they're really pushing hard to make sure they can counter the U.S. influence, particularly in the Western Pacific, and they're very motivated to do this. Again, they brook no dissension. They've cracked down very, very hard in the human rights area on the Uyghurs and Hong Kong, and certainly pressuring in Tibet and Taiwan. They have an interesting growing influence in world institutions, NGOs, and things as varied as the UN and other bodies that set standards for activities in the world. Why? Because they aim to shape the world in ways that are very, very helpful to them. They're mindful of the fact that the Western powers set up the rules of the road, if you would, for the world after World War II. And they would love to turn that around and make the rules their rules and not ours. So just a couple of things to wrap up here about President Xi, who I think is clearly not only the guiding light, but the ruler in a very, very autocratic, increasingly autocratic way. So Xi has a vision, and it's called the China Dream. And a couple of factors that go into this are, there's a vision in China that they're a phenomenally powerful country. They've been around for thousands of years. They've watched themselves go up and down. But in the last couple of hundred years, until the recent resurgence, they felt that they were humiliated, that they were put into a second-class status, and they've got a real burr under their saddle with this memory of the Western powers in particular coming into China, occupying parts of the country. I mean, just as a for instance, what do you think we would consider if we had Chinese gunboats up the Mississippi, up towards the Great Lakes? Well, we, the U.S. Navy, had gunboats in China back in the 1930s, 1,000 miles inland. And so they remember this stuff. They feel that it was an infringement on their sovereignty, and they don't like it. So that memory is there. They're preoccupied with Japan. Japanese invaded them, occupied Manchuria and most areas in the eastern part of China. They had never forgotten it. There's a great animosity that's just below the surface in many areas. And the other thing is they perceive that they've got the U.S. on the run right now, that we're diminished, that we're hurting, that they're a great economic power, and basically they're going to supplant us. And this is fueling their vision of a rise in a world power. So this is real. This isn't made up. And it's something that's the viewpoint from China and increasingly exported around the world is something that we really have to, again, take care of and contend with. So what do? Wring our hands, jump over the cliff, slash our wrist? Absolutely not. We've got the wherewithal to do whatever we set our minds to do, it seems to me. And so we ought to do that. We need whole of government policies, not just reactionary things. We need to get busy in our domestic areas. Congressman, that my proposal, if you would, to the legislature of this country. We need to revive our leadership in technical evolution and innovation, and we can do it with allies around the world. There's a tremendous amount that we can do to regain what prestige we've seen diminished and take our place leading the world. So thanks very much for having me. And Congressman, I'm really interested to hear what you think the Congress would like to do about this.
Admiral, thank you. Really a great scene setter and a great tour to Horizon. Congressman, over to you. Particularly interested in your perspective as a member of Congress and as a sitting on the Armed Services Committee, but also through your decades of experience in the Air Force. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Andrew. I appreciate you moderating. And I really enjoyed the Admiral's comments. I'm a farm boy growing up and then 30 years in the Air Force. There's a phrase they use in Congress, though, when they like what somebody says, they go, I associate myself with those comments. Now, that's not normal talk. I've never heard it until I got in Congress. So I'm going to say I associate myself with the Admiral's comments down the line. And by the way, I think one of the things that really is important is to put yourself in other people's shoes. And I think the Admiral did that really well with talking about the Chinese perception. And because I think that really explains a lot of their actions. And I think the Admiral really framed that really well. And for those who want to dig into that more, I think one of the best books I've ever read was Kissinger's book on China. Of course, it's a little older now, but really does a good job in framing that nationalism and that century of hurt that they had with Western dominance, and it really helped explain to me more of their mindset. What I'd like to do today is just, if we're going to talk about where Joe Biden's going forward, let's talk a little bit up front where we're at right now, and I think that will help us decide what he needs to be doing next and what he should continue on with the Trump administration's policies, and maybe what he needs to change. First of all, what I think is important for our folks to know that are listening today, that one of the positive things that have happened in the last 4 years is the strength of our military has been made much more healthy. Where we were at 4 years ago, and one of the reasons I was inspired to run, was our military was really struggling. Our readiness rates were as bad as they've been since 1977. And it's not my analysis, that was coming from the chiefs, the service chiefs out there. So I'll give you a few stats. Our Navy was at 50%, could only fly 50% of their aircraft. Our Army has 58 combat brigades. Only 3 were ready to deploy on any given day. Our Air Force is the oldest it's ever been when you look at the average age of the aircraft. And you look at some of the fatalities that we were having, particularly in the Navy, and the Admiral would have maybe a better perspective on this, but we had some accidents out there that should never have occurred. When you peel the onion back, a lot of our sailors were given the appropriate training. And so we really put a lot of work on this back in 2017 and 2018. And I really think we've made quite a lot of progress here. We increased spending by 10%. And today, if you look at the Navy, they have 80% mission ready rates on their aircraft today versus 50%. We have about 30 Army brigades ready to deploy. And that's about normal because some of them are already deployed. They're coming back. They're getting healthy. So we're in a much better deterrent state. And I think our modernization, though we're not out of the hole, we're on track. And so I think it's important to just frame one of the success stories I think that we've had. And it's my hope that the Biden administration will not make cuts to the military, but I don't think we need big increases either. I think we need to stick with inflation if we can. If we can hold it with inflation, our military will, incrementally just keep getting more and more healthy, and the modernization will get on track. One of the big debate points we're going to have, and it deals with the great power competition, is our nuclear modernization. And that's been a big debate in the last 4 years. I think it's going to continue now that the Biden administration has expressed interest in maybe cutting into the nuclear modernization. And it concerns me. I think the triad has served us well. And the area that's under most scrutiny right now is the ICBMs. And they are expensive to replace. But once you do replace them, they're actually fairly cost effective to maintain. And you have a very high readiness rate. And one of the things that concerns me, if you get rid of the ICBMs, our nuclear deterrence, I think, is undermined. You're looking at maybe 24 targets in America with that, which is a much more, tempting situation potentially for a bad leader, versus you have 400 ICBMs. It totally changes the deterrent dynamic. And so I wanted to put that on the table because that's going to be a topic here over the next year or two. We are in a great power competition. We were the unipower of the world from 1989 till now. And I would share the Admiral's view that we're still the dominant power, but it's changing. When you look at China's GDP, it is nearing our own, and its buying capability is already at our GDP purchasing power. Russia maybe only have the GDP of Mexico, but they've totally modernized their nuclear inventory. And they both, as the Admiral says, they're working against our interests, and it's somewhat complementary what they're doing, though they have different interests. I totally echo those thoughts. So you have these two areas of high GDP. They're going to match our capabilities and what they can do with their military versus Russia. A lot lower GDP, but they've totally modernized their nuclear inventory, maybe outside of their bombers, but their ICBMs and submarines, they surely have. And then we still have other concerns out there we got to keep our eyes on, like Iran. If I had to look forward, the area that concerns me the most for a nuclear threat and a nuclear exchange would be 10, 15, 20 years from now, if Iran ever gets that capabilities between them and Israel. And so that's I think the biggest flashpoint, it's not in the near term, but 10, 15 years, I believe that could be. And so we have to throw that into the equation. And we should still gonna have terrorism threats. So over the last, or at least since 2001, we've put our emphasis on counterterrorism, counterinsurgency. We've built 60 remote piloted aircraft caps. They're flying at all times, 60 caps. And that takes a lot of money. But from that, we've taken our eye off of what China and Russia was doing until the last year or two, last few years. And we fallen behind in some key areas like hypersonics and other, maybe AI, 5G, things like that. So we've had to reorient from a counterinsurgency, counterterrorism focus. We still got to keep a little eye on it, don't get me wrong, to figure out how do we recover in the great power competition. And I think we're making progress, but we're not where we want to be at. I would just put this as a key theme for me. There's no way that we can counter China, Russia, Iran on our own. We don't have the financial wherewithal, but yet we're still the indispensable nation in the world. The world can't counter these threats on their own without us. And so my view is we got to go back to what made us so successful during the Cold War, and that's with our alliances. When it comes to China, we need to nurture that relationship with Japan and Australia in particular, and hopefully integrate India over time into this construct. And today, most of this is bipolar, or I should say bilateral relations. And I would love to make it more multilateral with these major countries. But there's not an agreement on that, but that's, excuse me, my view. When it comes to Russia, NATO is vital. And I have not agreed with the administration, the current administration's slighting of the NATO relationship. We need that. We particularly need it when it comes to the Baltic states. So I just, if I was the president for a day, I would be really making the emphasis on our alliances and keeping our modernization. Because if we're going to defend our values and human dignity, liberty, the free market system, that's what it's going to take. Us by ourselves, we're going to be in retreat. And so we need to work with our allies to defend our values that we like. So key areas that we're going to have to focus on: cyber. You know, our military cyber is very good, but our domestic and industrial cyber is very vulnerable. Our financial sector, our energy sector, and we've seen that recently with the Russian hack. We're going to have to figure out a way how to defend our non-military cyber much better than what we're doing today. Space. The next Pearl Harbor will not be planes and torpedoes in Pearl Harbor. It's going to be attacks on our space, our communication satellites, our spy reconnaissance satellites, as well as cyber. And we're very dependent on space and thus very vulnerable to these space attacks. We need to build a robust capability that can survive first rounds of attacks. An area that I'm very involved with is electronic warfare. Electronic warfare allows you to use all your other domains: air, sea, cyber, ground, and so forth. And we are very vulnerable in the electronic magnetic spectrum today. And the other, China and Russia have surpassed us in these capabilities, and we need to make up that ground. So with that, so what should be Biden doing? Well, I hope he doesn't just throw out everything the president's done, but there are some things that need to be revised. I think the view that the Trump administration brought on China, maybe it was overreaction, but it was better than where we were at 4 and 8 years ago, I would say. China, we've had this view that if China liberalizes and gains economic value or growth, that they will liberalize. And actually the opposite has occurred. I think the Trump team, the Trump administration has made us alert to that. Not to say that they have it just right, but I think we've learned from the last 4 years what China has not liberalized like we thought they would. The Biden team could surely focus on strengthening our alliances, which has taken a beating, I believe, in the last 4 years. I wrote down a long list here, but I want to, because I think it's probably about time for Q&A. Also, just maybe close with this. I hope the President Biden administration doesn't make deep cuts to the military, because I keep hearing this, as they want, pay-fors for other things. And I think that would put us back to where we were at 4 and 6 years ago when we had a military at a readiness level of 1977, which we do not want to have. So I think with that, I'll just maybe turn the floor back over to you, Andrew, and ready for some Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, and Admiral Fallon, thank you too. I'm going to take moderator's privilege here and kind of push in on something I heard from both of you. You know, I guess probably befitting of your experiences. I think I'm pretty confident, and those of us at ASP are pretty confident in the U.S. military's ability to adapt and move towards this age of great power competition. But maybe I'm a bit more concerned about the idea that the whole of U.S. government, even the whole of society, is ready, prepared, or even understands it. You know, Congressman, you mentioned cyber, space, and AI. In a lot of those areas, the vulnerabilities aren't really the U.S. government stuff. It's private sector, whether it's electric utilities, or you know, the private communications companies, satellites, and such like that. How do we enact sort of this whole of society idea that we are now in a competition with China, with Russia? Certainly with China, I think the Chinese, being a more of a unitary state and society, is really beginning to focus their push onto, you know, businesses as part of the state, part of this great power competition. How do we begin to focus our society beyond just the military on this?
Admiral, do you want me to lead? I'll jump in. You know, it's hard because the American culture, we're not a dictatorship. Mm-hmm. The Washington, D.C. is not the same as Beijing and how it can influence the country. We're a federalism society where we put a lot of power at the state and local level. We have a society too that we do have a lot of Jacksonian, I would call it, culture, that we are more inward focused. We want to worry about our communities. We don't want to worry about the outside world. That's just a part of our American culture there. And it's hard to totally integrate and synchronize our country because it's just not our nature to do it. But yet it gives us a dynamic capability because of that. And so, I mean, there's strengths and weaknesses to that. And China could surely, as a dictatorship from Beijing and with President Xi, has that ability to galvanize society, but yet they don't get all the creativity and all the other things that come with our society, I believe, from that. But what you say is it is a real problem. And I think our vulnerability is not as much in the military side, it's in the non-military side. Like I already said, cyber, we're very vulnerable in the energy sector, the financial sectors. Our space is very vulnerable. I think we're putting the right emphasis now on AI and 5G, but we let the counterinsurgency focus of our country and the national security way take our attention away from those things. Now we got to back on it. And so I think, Andrew, you bring up a good challenge. That we're a decentralized country, and it makes it harder to do that. I think probably, though, a president can surely lay out a policy objectives and priorities and do better than what we've been doing. But it will always be a challenge for us on that, I believe. Sorry, Admiral, go ahead. Maybe you got a better answer than I do.
No,
what do you think?
Better answer, but I'll share my views here, and I certainly agree with your basic points. One of the problems I believe is that in this country we have lots of people doing many different things, and the tendency is to focus on the things immediately in front of us and let somebody else worry about other things. So in the competition, if you would, in the strategic challenges area, I believe for quite a few years now, we've tended to just offload this on the military. And we've attempted to deal with problems around the world with military answers. And I don't think that cuts it. It needs the whole government. It needs the rest of the government to be involved in it. But we've been distracted. We've spent a couple of decades now, in my opinion, wrapped around the axle in the Middle East. And every time it looks like we're about to step out of it, we seem to get sucked back in. I'll give you a perfect example in the last several weeks. We've got an aircraft carrier out there, the USS Nimitz, that's been on deployment for 8 some months now. It's way overdue to get back home, not just to get their sailors home, but because the ship needs maintenance. It's been worked very, very hard. But we can't seem to get it out of the Middle East. In fact, she was started home a few weeks ago and pulled back in again. Why? Because of concern about Iran and whatever. So if it isn't one thing, it's another, and it's all taken the focus off of what I believe the big issue. So in my view, we have big balls and little balls in life, and the biggest of the big balls, I believe, is China and our relationship with China as we go forward. And so we just haven't quite figured it out. So I concur with what the congressman said, and we need the president and the leadership, not just the individual, because he or she can't do everything, but they need to set the tone and get their administrations to enact, first of all, to think about and structure policies that are going to be long-term and will help us to our objective. I'll give you one example of an observation I've made being in and around Washington for the last 30 some years. It seems that every administration that comes in, and I don't care which one, Republican or Democrat, there's a common behavior, and it's not very good, and it's certainly not helpful for the country. And that is the new gang comes in, and immediately whatever the old gang was doing is, we're not going to do that. They did that. We're different. We're going to do something. Well, it turns out, guess what? If you go back and look at the strings, the common threads that go through these administrations, there are, in fact, a lot of similarities, despite the political rhetoric. And when you throw out the baby with the bathwater, which seems to be, again, underway, I think that's a big mistake. So there are some very good people, very dedicated people in this country who are generally apolitical. There are some very politically people, but they have good ideas. And so harnessing those things to do good is important. I'll give you I'll point out one behavior of China that is really impressive to me. So it's an autocracy. The dictates from the Communist Party tell people what to do, how to do it, when to do it, and so forth. But they've been focused on a lot of domestic activity in addition to the international thing. So one thing that may have escaped notice until the last couple of weeks, they've been embarked on a program to convert themselves from basically dependent on coal for everything, for all their energy and for the heating of individual homes. And they're trying to convert to natural gas. Staggering undertaking to the tune of their target, something like 10 million houses to convert away from coal each year. Well, right now it's pretty cold up in Northeast Asia. There's a huge demand for heating and they can't meet it. They don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the resources. Well, guess who does? We do in the US. We've got ample supplies thanks to fracking and some other capabilities. We could supply the LNG and then some. So my view is everybody in the world needs something. And that to me is the basis for figuring out ways that we can do trade-offs, not diminishing our priorities and our national beliefs, but ways that we can work with other people to try to figure out how we move ahead into a world that is increasingly interdependent. And I think it'd serve us well. But the big thing is we need the administration, in my opinion, to sit down, craft a long-term policy. Where do we want to be? Not how do we keep China from doing this or Russia from doing that, but where do we as a nation and a people want to be? And let's figure out how to get there. And a lot of these other problems are going to kind of be diminished, I believe, by the greatness that we could be.
A really important point that competition doesn't mean solely I win, you lose. Competition can be, mutually beneficial, and there are ways to work with and trade with and engage with these other countries. It doesn't mean that we are destined to be enemies. A couple of questions here from the participants about technology. And of course, American technological leadership has been a key enabler of U.S. economic vitality and also national security leadership. But developments, particularly in China, but also in Russian military hardware, have eaten into this technological advantage we have. What are your thoughts? Are there any specific non-military technologies that you think perhaps the U.S. government or military should be strategically investing in or protecting, or as we go forward?
I'll take a first crack at it, unless the Admiral would like to lead the way. But, it's interesting that the military had been the source of a lot of our technology growth for decades, and now it's reversed. The private sector generates technology much faster than the military. And we have to rethink our acquisition capabilities on this, because we do a 15-year program to get the F-35. That just don't work no more. We have to be able to get stuff commercially faster. It has to be compatible with other technologies, which that's a little bit of a challenge for us. But we have to change our paradigm. The military today now has to grab technology from the commercial side, and we have to find a way to spiral that in faster. And we have an old bureaucratic mindset that makes it very challenging. A second thought is China and Russia both have just stolen our technologies, intellectual property. They just gutted it. And our cybersecurity in that has been terrible. And we have to figure out how do we do better to protect our intellectual secrets from China. I think there's got to be a consequence when this happens out there. So when it comes to the protecting our intellectual property, our nation has to do better there. And I think we hopefully we're figuring that out, but I don't think we're there yet. But does that get to your question, Andrew, a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. That's right. Is there any particular ones that you're excited about or think are most at risk?
There's the hypersonics we fell behind on, mainly because, as we've already both said, the Admiral and I, our eyes were on the Middle East and counterterrorism. So we're playing catch up there, though I know we're making some strides. I'm impressed right now with what the Air Force is doing for a follow-on to the F-22. They've taken it out of the normal acquisition processes. I've done a lot of interesting acquisition techniques, and they're already flying a prototype to the follow-on to the F-22. And we're going to have that kind of mindset if we're going to stay ahead of this technology race. Other areas that I think we're going to continue to see is more of the remote piloted aircraft, but instead of one operator flying multiple aircraft, we're going to see swarms. I think we're going to see more automation warfare, or trying to think of the right word, is autonomous operations. We're going to see more of that, which is a little scary, but the AI is going to feed into that. So AI is a part of that. I also think we're going to start seeing more miniaturization of capabilities. If you can miniaturize a weapon to the size of your hand, that's very hard to detect. And I think that is another, maybe in the next generation, we're going to see more of those kind of capabilities. I think stealth will continue to be something that, as a country, we're going to be using and perfecting with the B-21 and beyond. And so, but the Chinese are doing everything they can to grab where we're ahead, and circumvent their own technology or own research. So with that, I yield.
Yeah, Admiral, what do you think about technologies to enable national security leadership, and how do you even get them into the military in a more effective way?
Well, the key point the Congressman made that I'm not sure folks really have a great appreciation for is how dramatic the shift has been in research and development in this country, away from government-sponsored and primarily DoD motivation and startups, if you would. So it's almost all in the private sector now for the reasons the Congressman mentioned. But from my view, we as a nation are not particularly very much investing in that development of new technology. And it's very, very basic. In education, for example, continuing to encourage our young people to get involved in the STEM programs and the technology end of this. It isn't all about politics. We have got to have people that understand the technology. I'm afraid on the negative side that we have a huge part of our younger population now that doesn't have the foggiest idea how things really happen. It's magic, you know, you pick up a phone, whatever. Well, if you think for a minute about the advances, if you're a guy my age, look at where we've come just in 20, 30 years, it's staggering. But a point about this, so people talk about artificial intelligence and machine learning. Well, guess what? There's a person that starts out this business with the learning. There are people that have to write the algorithms that tell these devices what to do and so forth. So anyway, back to your basic question, developing this technology base requires a significant jack up, I believe, in higher education. But before you get high, you got to start low. And looking at scores from states around the country and what our younger people are learning or appear to be learning, it's kind of sobering. But we can do a lot better. I'm convinced we will do a lot better if we continue to look and encourage in the commercial sector those things that are gonna really change the way we do things. And so information technology appears to be the area that we've made the largest advances in recent years. There are other things out there in the biologics that people have been saying for a number of years now, we're close, but no real breakthrough. I think it's coming, but to have a national strategy for investment in promising technologies, I think would help us a lot, not just for the military, but for the commercial and civilian sectors as well.
If I may just piggyback one brief comment, I think that Admiral's absolutely right about the education and system and helping our STEM programs for our, whether it's K through 12, but also post-secondary. But an area that I think we've hurt ourselves in the current administration is we've made it harder for people to immigrate to our country. And we have always been the bright, shining hill where people want to come to our country. And we've brought in so much talent, whether it's India or wherever it may be from, people with a very high STEM background. And somehow or another, we've clamped down on that. I don't know that I think that's hurt us. When we bring in the world's brightest and they want to be American citizens, we gain. And so I think we should review that policy, by the way, because that really does give us capabilities in the 5G, the AI down the road. The best heart surgeon in India, or in Omaha, came from India in our town. In fact, it was a husband-wife team, the best heart surgeons from India. We've gained from bringing in wonderful people from all over the world, and I think we should reevaluate what we've been doing in that area.
Such an important point.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, we're basically fundamentally always have been, and I think ought to continue to be, an immigrant country where we welcome people that are interested in bettering themselves and their fellow man. It's kind of a no-brainer. So I cheer you on, Congressman. If you can motivate a coalition up there to set that right, I think we'll be well served.
I have a couple questions here from the participants about alliances, and each of you touched on this a little bit in your opening discussions, but it's a key part of U.S. leadership and competition throughout our last 70 years of history has been about building and maintaining alliances, but perhaps that has fallen off. Not just in the last 4 years, but throughout the entire unipolar moment. What can a new administration do to rebuild the alliances? Are there challenges to these alliances? Do they need to be repurposed in some way, whether it's NATO or the alliance structure in East Asia?
I surely think there's a need for NATO, and that doesn't mean we can't repurpose a little bit and evaluate. Clearly Russia is still a threat, particularly in the Baltic states. You see what they've done to Ukraine, taking the Crimea and going into the Donetsk region. We see what they're doing in Georgia.
Mhm.
So it's not a far reach to think, hey, the Baltics and our allies are a threat. And I think NATO has served with us in the Middle East and everywhere we have thought it was very important. We've had NATO countries at our side. And that's a blessing to have. So I disagree with the president's moves about Germany. I mean, we have two big air bases there, Ramstein and Spangdahlem, and they wanted to close Spangdahlem. I'll tell you, those two air bases are pivotal for what we do in the Middle East and Africa. And one air base there does not have the throughput that you need to support 3 different continents, right? And so I pushed back on that. We were able to write in the NDAA to prevent moving out of Spangdahlem until the next administration gets to look at it. I also think I could just make that argument across the board that the current administration has been maybe too critical of our alliances, and I think that's hurt us. I'm of the view that we are the indispensable country, as already mentioned, and we got to be a leader, but we got to be a humble leader. I think we got to be able to listen and respect our allies, and that's how you build an alliance system. And I think now the next area that we got to really focus on is in Asia, where we have bilateral relationships with Japan and Australia. Not much coordination between the two of them, though. And I think India, we want to bring into this fold over time. They have a culture of non-alignment, so it's going to be gradual. I get that, but they worry about China as much as anybody does. And then we have smaller countries like Vietnam and et cetera that want to be part of this network. And I think we have an opportunity to grow this alliance system and that would serve our interests. Ultimately, we have a national security interest to do this, right? So that's important. I think just broader speaking, if we want to have liberal values predominant in our world, it's going to take that to do it. And alliances of defending our values of liberty, individual liberty and free markets and, equality under the law, rule of law, all those things that we embrace, it's going to take America leading an alliance system of folks that share those values. So I yield to the Admiral.
No, let me echo that. A couple of thoughts. One, aspects of alliances that maybe don't come to mind readily, but are very real. And before that, though, the most important thing I believe is we've got to restore confidence in our own credibility with our allies and with those that we would like to have as partners and allies. Because right now, I believe the view that I've heard from colleagues around the world is we don't know what to believe about you. We don't know how far we can trust you guys and gals in the United States, because you've reneged on commitments that we thought were pretty well a given. And so we're going to have to work hard, I believe, to restore that confidence and credibility in ourselves. But give you an example of how some of this works. So in Asia, an area that's particularly critical to this discussion, we have a long-term ally in Japan. And the roots of that go back to the end of World War II, in which the United States basically assumed the responsibility for the defense of Japan. And in exchange, the Japanese forewent the establishment of a military structure, an army and a navy. So they have self-defense forces, and it's been that way since the last 75 years or so. But we said, okay, don't worry, we'll take care of your defense. Well, we have another ally over there in Republic of Korea. In South Korea, the history there, I won't go back through, but the reality is that there is a lot of friction between these two countries, South Korea and Japan. It's in our interest, the United States interest, to have them work together and cooperate in any number of things for lots of reasons, not least of which is, again, with China, their objective internationally is to work unilaterally with individual countries and not have countries collectively work on policies that might be less than desirable in Beijing. So how do we get the South Koreans and the Japanese to work together? It's a challenge because of an acrimonious history between the two, but it's something that pays and could pay huge dividends for us in collectively counterbalancing some of this influence that China's had. And go back to a little bit of my experience in NATO. I can tell you for a fact that I was very frustrated back when I was a bit younger to sit in meeting after meeting in NATO where it seemed like the political leadership just endlessly went on and on and on about this, that, or the other thing, and you just shake your head and say, "Stop! Let's get on and do something." But I have to tell you that there was almost never a meeting that I attended that I didn't learn something in all of this this rhetoric, things that I hadn't thought of or I thought that the U.S. hadn't really focused on that might be beneficial to us and to the alliance together. So there's a lot of good that goes on. Yeah, we get frustrated and we think we're the big cheese and everybody ought to do what we say. Yeah, I hear all that, but there are things you can learn. And again, back in the military world of the Congressman and I in our past, I know he would probably echo the same thing. When you work with partners from other countries, yeah, we may have the most robust technology and the biggest and the fastest and blah, blah, blah. But these smaller countries always bring something to the table. And they bring things that we may not major in, that we may have overlooked, but things that are really necessary to the big picture. And that's one of the strongest reasons for having allies. Together, cooperative, you can do almost anything. If we're divided and separate and squabbling, not much good occurs. So I'm a big fan of alliances. We ought to be working overtime to make these better.
An example of that, if I may, when I was in Iraq working with Joe Petraeus, the American mindset was find the terrorists and kill them. It was that simple, right? You're going to hunt down everybody you can and kill every terrorist you can find. And the British and the Australians come in and they go, some of these guys you're not going to be able to, they're not going to change. You're going to have to kill them. But there's these other guys over here, you may be able to, over time, they may be able to come over to your side if you give them a little respect and listen to them. So we got to try to separate the incorrigibles, if you will, versus the ones that we can maybe pull in. And they sort of changed our whole mindset of trying to seek where we could find the ability to bring some people over and then focus on the ones you can't. And I would just say that's an example of what Admiral Fallon's saying of how the allies broaden our perspective and make a change in policy. I think it made a difference in that era of the Iraq campaign.
Yeah, they broaden your horizons. They broaden your vision. They cause you to think, yeah, we're not as smart as maybe we think we are.
Yeah, I think it was Brent Scowcroft called alliance maintenance a process of gardening. It's just constant tending to it, feeding it, watering it, talking to the plants, all that sort of stuff. It's important, and it's I'm sure sometimes difficult. One thing that kind of goes along those same lines as being important and difficult is bipartisanship. And in our divided times, our polarized political space right now, I'm thinking especially for you, Congressman Bacon, but also Admiral Fallon, what are the areas where we can find bipartisanship in building this strategy for China, this strategy for Russia, great power competition? How can we rebuild this bipartisanship instead of an idea of where it's my national security versus your national security? How can we get back to this idea of politics stops at the water's edge on these things?
Well, in this discussion of big power competition, I believe our worst threat is our partisanship right now and our divide in our own country. When I traveled in Asia last year, when you talk to some of the smaller countries, they'll say, China's coming in with a lot of financial resources. They want to, operate out our ports and this and that. America, you need to come in with a little more. But however, they said, in the end, what attracts us most to America is our values. And that's still the most valuable thing we have in our dealings in the world is freedom. What happened this past week in Washington, I believe, took the bright shining city on a hill and dimmed that light to a degree. When America's capital is swarmed the way it was, that was just reprehensible and disgusting, and it did not reflect well on our democracy and our republic. And it was terrible. If we can't start figuring out how to, instead of being two camps of war with each other, it's so hard to solve the immigration problem, the healthcare problem, our national security orientation. When we're more worried about each other, it's very hard to solve these very important problems. And so I think that the wave of the future, if we're going to get out of this, in Congress anyway, is to form bipartisan groups and working together. So I'm on the Four Country Caucus, which is a group of about 25 veterans that are half Republican, half Democrat, roughly. And we're committed to work together. I'm on the Problem Solvers Caucus, which is a member of 25 Republican, 25 Democrats. We're trying to find ways to work together, because that's what it's going to take if we're going to make an impact. And I've seen some effects already. We were able to get that last COVID supplemental done through the Problem Solvers Caucus. We put this plan together with 25 Republican, 25 Democrats, and a month later, we were able to get it passed. Right now we have a mindset, let's destroy the other side. The Democrats or the Republicans are our biggest enemy, not Al-Qaeda or not, that's how we're treating ourselves. And it's not healthy. We live in the greatest country in the world, greatest opportunities, and we've lost sight of that with our hate towards each other.
Yeah, we can always find things to disagree on. I mean, that's just a given. Mm-hmm. But the key to progress and the key to restoring the image and likeness that we'd like to have in this country, I believe, is finding common ground, those things we can agree on. And I really applaud the Congressman's initiative in trying to encourage these groups on the Hill that are going to figure out ways to work together. And I think that's the real future. And then have a common baseline, a common understanding of what the issues are, and then picking the big balls, if you would, and moving forward. So just got to do it.
Well, thank you. We've come up on our time here at 10:30. I want to encourage our participants to see some of the links that we put up on the chat. You can always follow us on Twitter. Go to our website, americansecurityproject.org. We'll put up the video of this event there, as well as our previous events this week. I want to join in COVID times. In normal times, this is where we would have a big round of applause for our audience. But what you hear is the sound of one hand clapping. But we do really appreciate your time with us. Congressman, safe travels back to Nebraska. Admiral, thank you for being with us, and great to have you as always.
It's a pleasure and honor. Thanks.
Likewise.
Thank you. Thanks to all.